when people talk about cheap coal as well, there's no, it's not really that cheap when you look at the fact that it uses enormous amounts of water.
Yeah.
It pollutes that water, so we cannot use it. And one of your listeners already talked about the fact that we have water scarce. It impacts on health because of the carbon emissions. You're talking about mining. So, Kusile is going to cost South Africa 60 billion rand a year because we need to deal with these kind of hidden impacts.
Okay, Bobby, before I get Mr. Apane to respond.
Kulani, three things, if I may.
Yeah.
One is that the water was touched upon.
Yeah.
The World Bank Inspection Panel is still investigating Medupi because of the broader problems with Medupi, and that investigation is not completed. It's been now for a year and a half. And the big issue there is that Medupi is reliant on water, especially for their sulfur scrubbers, and they're not going to be able to get that water, so we're not going to get the sulfur scrubbers. So that's the one thing. The second thing, in terms of acceleration of access of energy to the poor, groundwork, Friends of the Earth works in places like the Vaal Triangle and Highveld. I've been in townships where you can't see 10 meters in front of you in a winter's night because of the thick smog. Now, the reality is there that government has gone on a three-pronged strategy. One is to force people to burn more coal indoors via the Bussa method. The second thing is to start pushing renewable energy for communities. And the third strategy was better housing. They've done nothing on the latter two, and all they are pushing is burning coal indoors. The reality there, and Peter Lukey said this in Parliament about 2 years ago, that reality results in the South African government having to foot a bill of 4 billion rand every year because of industrial air pollution and household air pollution on people's health. And so I think the reality there is this big, massive overdrive of fossil fuel development in South Africa is not about jobs, it's not about access, but rather it's about securing, as Bobby Godsell said, the cheapest electricity that the world has to provide for big multinationals to export wealth out of South Africa.
I guess the question again for Mr. Apane is whether or not South Africa can break its link with the fossil fuels.
Xolani, that's a little bit incomplete, is that picture. Let's start with the point about renewable energy technologies for households, right? Xolani, you might have not only heard about it, but you would have seen it yourself, right? We have a massive solar water heating program at the domestic sector, right? In terms of which we want to.
But it's not been picked up, brother.
All
it's not been picked up,
in South Africa. Let me just make the point. All rooftops in South Africa with solar water heating, so that we can then not burn as much coal for water heating purposes, but that we can transfer that load to a renewable resource like we have in abundance in this country, the sun. That program, right, the Minister of Energy announced that by 2014 rather, that we would want to have hit a target of 1 million, solar water heaters on people's homes. That is very significant. In fact, it's such a very, ambitious program that we believe that at the end of this program, on the African continent, perhaps in the world, that you would not see as many solar water heating solutions or technologies.
Sorry, what is the target there?
That's one of the issues.
1 million when?
In order to address this particular issue around, this perception that we are pushing the coal.
Kolani, may I interject here?
Mr. Apane, just 1 second, just because I need clarity there.
The facts about water for the Medupi scrubbers not being available is not true, right? That is not correct.
Been investigated.
That is. Yeah, the facts of the matter are that the water is available. There are issues around, the extent to which one can place 100% reliance, and it's a technical matter that we can discuss. But the water is available. It is one of the conditions in relation to that, a loan that was given.
All right, a couple of just factual issues that I would like to establish, Mr. Apane. Firstly, in terms of the targets for the the heaters?
Solar water heaters.
Solar water heaters. What is the target for when?
We're saying that by 2014, we're wanting to have
1 million.
Reached 1 million.
How much do we have now?
We have by about May last year, we had 115,000. So far this year, we have done 43,000, if I remember my numbers correct.
And you want 1 million in 3 years. You want 1 million in 3 years.
Let me just explain that. There are issues in relation to finding a financing solution in order to accelerate that program. But we believe we now have found a workable solution, and you will see a very significant acceleration in that program.
Bobby?
We're focusing in on the wrong side of the problem. As residents in this country, as people in this country, we use 16% of all the electricity that is used. 16%. The majority, the energy-intensive users and industry use up to 60+% of that energy. And you're asking for a reduction on the group that uses 16%.
Yeah.
So that reduction just does not make sense mathematically. You ask for big demand-side reduction.
Let's ask the DDG though.
May I interject?
Interject, Mr. Apane. Mr.
Bobby
Apane
doesn't understand the game here. Bobby just doesn't understand the game.
Okay, tell me about the game.
because
Bobby,
if you
let's
go
give
to the
Apane a
ground,
chance.
People don't have electricity.
Okay, let's give Apane a chance. Then explain that for us, because
I apologize. I interjected there, but Tolani,
Yes.
that's a complete misunderstanding of what we're trying to do here. Right? Yes, it's only 16% of the contribution in the grid. In other words, the domestic sector only uses 16% of the total portfolio of power that's available.
Yeah.
But that's from an electricity perspective. Remember, this is also about climate change. When people do not use the electricity, for heating the water and all of it, don't assume that they're not going to use firewood, they're not going to, use cow dung and all of these traditional, environmentally unfriendly carriers in order to heat their water, to cook, etc., etc. So you won't.
But your balance, your financial.
All right, Mr. Apane. But I think the point has been. I'm going to come to you, Furiel, in a minute, because I really want to elaborate the point, Mr. Apane. I think the point here is that perhaps you're putting a lot of pressure on us, the ordinary citizens, when you should be talking to big companies in South Africa. They are the ones that should be.
We need to explain what we're doing in that space.
Are they putting you under pressure?
To that point about us not taking the domestic sector seriously from a renewable energy perspective. I've merely indicated.
But you're not. The figures say that.
We can talk about what we do with key industrial customers, if that's what we want to do.
Well, look, you've set targets already for these key industrial sectors, and already they are rejecting the targets that you've set. In fact, the Chamber of Mines just was a couple of days ago saying that they are unhappy about the reduction targets that the department has already set. In fact, they're putting pressure on you. Are you able to withstand their pressure?
Exactly, but you see, that's the point. We're saying that we have absolutely no choice. Energy efficiency, forget about, all of these supply side options. Where we really need to be putting a lot of focus is on the energy efficiency side, because it can be done quickly.
But the point I'm trying to say, Mr. Apane, to you is that, yes, I understand you have a lot of pressure, but you must stand up to the targets that you've already set. You must say when Chamber of Mines comes back to you and says, no, but we can't, and you say, well, we want you to.
What they introduced, Kolani, if I may, is what this thing called the margin of error. So what they do is when Sasol and Eskom puts pressure on government, they suddenly say, okay, we won't talk about the definitive figure. We'll open it up and say we'll have a 200 million ton margin of error.
Okay, Furiel wanted to say something.
No, I just wanted to say, I mean, the point has moved, because I was going to say to Umpi that, when you're talking about energy efficiency at residential areas, when you just take Kusile, for example, it's going to be emitting 37 million tons of greenhouse gases a year. So obviously our focus has to move towards those big industries and tackle the energy intensive users group, which is just 36 companies responsible for 45% of the electricity usage. Even within that, the whole issue of the carbon tax came up, and there was a lot of hype about possibly having a carbon tax, but Eskom and a lot of the energy intensive users group basically said, well, if you tax us, we're going to put it onto the consumers. And government did not say anything about that. They then backed off. So those kind of things makes it really hard to work.
But is it not fair that we should also understand the complexity of the situation, and also how difficult it is for government, because government has got to balance these things.
It's very difficult. We understand that, but then don't make narrow perspective decisions and stick to coal and nuclear. Because then that just makes it worse, and it kind of has a cycle that doesn't get you out of where you are.
But again, you need an economy that's competitive. And if government were to haphazardly introduce renewable energy when it has to compete with other countries as well, I mean, you lose the footing there, don't you?
It needs to be. South Africa could have can become a renewable energy hub in terms of investment and manufacturing and actually using renewable energy.
South Africa
Egypt is doing it.
Can South Africa be a guinea pig? I mean, if all other countries don't want to do it, South Africa is not going to
China's
blindly.
doing it.
China's doing it. India's doing it. You've got countries in Africa who are doing
But
it.
the base from which China is doing it, Bobby.
I-
Isn't there a difference between the base from which China is doing it? I mean, China is clearly the biggest emitter or one of the biggest emitters in the world. So they've got the base is totally different with South Africa.
We are also one of the big emitters in the world, and considering that the majority of those emissions are taken by companies and the rich in the country, it's ever more so damaging because the poor suffer. We need to remember that 42% of the greenhouse gases in Africa are emitted by South Africa alone. I think what is critical here is we need to ask the very demanding question of, when we talk about with the need of development, the need for jobs, on which logic are we talking? Now, we got to this climate change disaster because of the logic of capitalism. Now, both Lavia Campesina and Wolfgang Sachs says very clearly about the UNFCCC negotiations which South Africa is involved in. It's not about protecting the climate. It's about protecting governments, national governments, global's economic interest. But interest that does not serve the people, but interest that serves corporate capital.
Okay.
And it was only Bolivia in Cancun that stood up and said we disagree with it. And everybody else, including South Africa and other governments, stepped back and agreed with the Cancun